Hi, and we're back, and I'm talking about the third part of chapter 22 on evolution. So we've already gone over the process of evolution. I gave a nice summary of lots of the lines of evidence that supports our idea of making this a theory. Now I want to talk a little bit about how Darwin came up with his hypothesis, now theory, and how it's an example of how science builds on all the people that came before. Because Darwin by himself would have never come up with this work. And it's really a combination of things that other people had already published and put out there. And his genius was kind of taking what other people had noticed and recombining them in a new way and actually putting it together into a new theory. So we'll get going. And so here's a picture of Charles Darwin and, of course, his book, The Origin of Species from 1859. And when we get to it, it took him about 15 years to put together this work and longer time to actually before it was published. But jumping ahead a little bit with that, and I'll come to that in a minute. So what I want to do is go over and talk about the different people that had a strong influence on Darwin writing this book, right? And it's an example of science building on previous discoveries. Some of the names you may have heard before. Linnaeus, we go over in our very first lab on systematics, so you may have already heard about Linnaeus. Lamarck had his own theory on evolution. Cuvier studied paleontology. We have Malthus, who's a population sociologist looking at Paris. Lyell, following on the work of Hutton, is a very significant geologist. And Wallace was another biologist who actually came up with the exact same ideas and is considered the co-discoverer of natural selection. Right? Of these, Lyell and Wallace were alive during the time of Darwin, and Darwin actually knew them and actually were very good friends with them. So they kind of worked together a little bit. Okay, so when we talk about how the different lines of evidence that supports the idea that Darwin had, it's also some of the things that made Darwin think, right? And so biogeography, I've talked a little bit about. Wallace actually came up with his idea on natural selection by just studying biogeography. And he's probably the most preeminent biogeographer, definitely in that time. And even since then, very few people have matched his discoveries, all right? Fossil record, Cuvier and other people will provide that evidence so that they knew past life was different, right? Comparative morphology, Linnaeus's classification, organisms were grouping into these categories, and it just led to the obvious conclusion that the reason they're grouping in those categories is they're related somehow, right? Artificial selection. Darwin was from a well-to-do family, and he purchased a farm, and on it he would select different varieties of plants that will grow in the area. He also took up a hobby of breeding pigeons, and in part to give an example of how artificial selection can modify species, right? So he knew about that. Geology provides the age and the time for evolution to take place, the age of the earth and the time of evolution to take place. Malthus will have some very interesting insights in terms of competition within populations. And then, of course, the first famous theory that was rejected, or hypothesis, I should say, was Lamarck's hypothesis on evolution. So, up to Darwin's time, and even Darwin, when he went to school, all the schools in England were run by the Church of England, even though he was a Unitarian. But what was taught then and was kind of accepted all throughout the scientific community was this idea of natural theology, right? It was breaking down in some areas, but kind of the general, what everyone would talk about, or the given dogma at the time, with the use of the term dogma, was natural theology. So basically, it was a literal interpretation of the Christian Bible. The earth was considered to be 6,000 years old. No new species were being made. They were all made at one time. No physical changes. Mountains weren't coming up. The valleys weren't eroding down, right? And the whole idea that Linnaeus started was this puzzle of this diversity of life, and somehow if they were all put into some categorization pattern, they would reveal some kind of divine plan, all right? And so that was kind of the idea all the way up to Darwin's time, and a lot of the discussion with Lyell and Wallace and other people really came down to finally rejecting this idea of natural theology and replacing it with other things. Okay, Linnaeus we've talked about in our first lab, right? And so he developed modern taxonomy, basing on the groups of morphology. Remember, this is before genetics, right? And it's interesting to point out we can list all these people's ideas on evolution because evolution was being talked about, right? Darwin did not come with it first. It was a hotly contested idea that had popped up from centuries before, and I'm listing Lamarck, but I could list 7, 8 people who had different ideas and hypotheses that were out there about evolution, all right? So we know what a lot of people thought about it, and wasn't called evolution, it was called transmutation of species. Could species change over time, all right? Linnaeus, remember, well before Darwin, well before any of these other ideas were out there, was citing against that, all right? But it's interesting because, ironically, Linnaeus' information in this system will provide some of the best evidence for evolution, especially when you look at making a phylogeny with finches on the Galapagos Islands. And so we went over this in lab, and so we have our categories, many more categories than he had originally. So we have species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, and then domain. Each one including more and more and a bigger diversity of organisms. Want to just point out and put him in context. He's the earliest of the people that I'm listing here. And so when he first made this idea of putting things in these categories, it caused this revolution in science, and a lot of people just went out and started collecting things to put them in these categories and start naming things and make this whole taxonomy flush out. And so some stuff he got is actual type specimens. Other stuff he was just working on books, and so there's all sorts of mythological creatures that were thrown in there and all sorts of other stuff. So it's very early science when Linnaeus was getting it going. Okay, next person I want to mention is Cuvier. And Cuvier is considered one of the founders of the science of paleontology. And so one of the things that came about in Cuvier's time is the idea that in areas outside of Paris, he's French, it's a very uniform river valley. And so you get things building up over time. Something similar would be if you go to the Grand Canyon, where you also get these strata building up over time and very uniform. And so as you go down, lower down, right, the older layers are lower down, and they have organisms that are less similar to the ones in the higher strata, more recent, right? Also, Cuvier, again, argued against the ideas of evolution that are around. He related everything to catastrophic events like Noah's flood, remember, of natural theology. And then when something moved out, right, other things would move in, all right? But he did notice that there's simpler organisms farther back becoming more complex. You have areas of times when they have the age of the reptiles and dinosaurs replaced by mammals later on. All right, and so that kind of rudimentary understanding of the fossil record was already taking place. Right, so Cuvier is very significant for that part. Okay, and Lamarck. Lamarck, following Cuvier in Paris, used the ideas of the fossil record and changes, and used the classic example of the giraffe. But what he came up with is the idea that species are changing over time, and the net result is that the species are, in the end, better suited to the environment that they're forming in. All right? And so, and that is significant, and that's really influenced Darwin. All right? Lamarck's famous for the person who got it, quote, wrong, only in that he tried to explain it not understanding anything about genetics and how traits could get passed on. And so his classic example is here. You see the young giraffe, right? It's stretching its neck to reach the leaves higher up in the trees. And if it were eating the leaves higher up in the trees, it would be better suited. And the fact that it stretched its neck caused its baby to be born with a longer neck. Right? So obviously genetics doesn't work that way. All right? But what you're seeing is the response in the species change, right, to the environment. Right? We now know, looking at Darwin, that he would explain it, or we would explain it with natural selection, and that you have a variety of giraffes, right? The ones who happen to be taller can eat higher up in the tree. They get more food. They reproduce more. They would tend to have also offspring that tend to be taller, some even taller than them, maybe some a little bit smaller. And if that trend continued over time, the species would continue to get taller, right? A very different mechanism than what Lamarck. But Lamarck had significant influence in that it's the species changing to suit the environment, and it's the mechanism that he was lacking. Right? Malthus is interesting. So Malthus, you might make a jump and think, how did he influence evolution? So he studied economics and populations, and he was there towards the end of the French Revolution, and he went to Paris, and he was interested in seeing how getting rid of the noble class and establishing kind of a working class, a middle class, was going to play out in France. And what he discovered in Paris is there's still a lot of poverty. And so when he came up with some ideas is he noticed, one, that in the city there wasn't great transportation yet, so resources are limited. Getting food into the city was hard, right? The population in the city was growing faster than the resources. And so the population were struggling with each other to acquire those resources, causing competition. And he came up with the term survival of the richest, because the richest people could afford to buy the resources, the food, and maintain their family with shelter and medicines. And so they would reproduce at a higher rate than the poor people and keep maintaining themselves, right? Reading through this, you can see step by step all of these things were significantly important to Darwin and when he was forming his theory. And it's kind of my throughout there for a GE course. This is something that Darwin would have read about when he was going to college, even though he was studying natural history, right? So anyway, he was exposed to this, so he knew about this work from well before Darwin. Okay, these last two are ones that are people that lived with Darwin and had great influence on him in his life. And so Lyell is a geologist. He's moving on from an earlier British geologist, Hutton. And so Hutton came up with this idea that the Earth slowly changes very gradually over time, right? And so the Earth is very old. So Lyell's been building on that. The Earth is very, very old. But he comes up with two kind of very remarkable and revolutionary ideas for the time. And that valleys formed by erosion, right? But the other part was that mountains formed by uplifting, so that the whole face of the Earth is changing, right? You can get mountains pushing up and valleys eroding out, right? He saw slow processes over time, but also with periods of very rapid change, right? And so he has these mechanisms of change are constant over time, right? Other thing about Lyell is that he publishes his book in 1831, right before Darwin, right at the same time Darwin is actually leaving on his voyage on the Beagle. And so he reads Lyell's book and finds it very challenging at the time. Darwin didn't get on that boat thinking about he wanted to go find evidence of evolution. He had just finished school and he understood everything as being natural theology, all right? And so Lyell's book really challenged him a lot, right? And by the he saw some evidence without getting into the whole talk about everything he did on his trip. But he actually saw some evidence of an area after an earthquake where there had been a significant amount of uplifting. And so that really challenged Darwin, and that really made him rethink Lyell. And that's the first time he writes in his notes, he's really thinking about the age of the Earth and some of these ideas of geology. Okay, the next person comes about well after Darwin has his theory. And so Wallace is a famous biogeographer, alive at the same time of Darwin, working in South, actually kind of went through the same area as Darwin, but he settled into Australia, Indonesia area. And he was looking at the distribution of species, and he kind of came up with what's now called the Wallace line. And you notice that all the species north of the mid part through Malaysia are related to other species, or will be in the same categories as other species in Asia. And below that line, everything seems to be related to different groups of species, like marsupials, right, in Australia. And looking at this, he's coming about and thinking about how would those species, why would they be in different groups, found in different areas. He studies the behavior of species. And independently of Darwin, he comes up with the idea of natural selection, right? That you have a variety of traits. Some are favored in increased reproduction, and those traits are passed on, right? And so Wallace is important because he's the one that gets Darwin to publish his paper, and the fact that an independent second person came up with the same idea gives credence to the whole concept or theory, right? And so he's considered the co-discoverer, so of equal weight really to Darwin. Although Darwin, of course, has the book that comes out that makes him much more famous initially than Wallace. And so if we look, Darwin, and following through his life, he goes to school. He studies natural history. Initially, he wanted to do medicine. He couldn't stomach medicine. Literally, if you think about surgery before anesthesia and or even concepts of sterilization, it was literally very bloody. And so he switched to natural history. Right? He is influenced by a variety of people, and I can mention other people that had ideas of evolution, but he and himself, when he gets on this boat, starts his voyage, is not thinking about evolution. He's still pretty strict natural theology, just out of school, just believing everything he's been taught. Right? He's paid to actually collect specimens and send them back to London as they're exploring around the southern hemisphere. Takes 5 years he's away. He's sending things back constantly as he's collecting. And the reason it's a private ship, the reason they're doing that, this is the age of exploration, and I would say exploitation, right? So they're trying to find areas. What the boat is doing offshore is looking for areas to build ports. Darwin's going onshore to see what life is there that could be extracted and brought back and sold, all right? And that's the reality of what was going on at the time. And so Darwin goes on South America, and things that influence him is one, biogeography. So as he gets to South America, he's not surprised that things look different from England. But what he is surprised is as he goes farther and farther south, the climate and the overall shape of the vegetation looks just like Europe, yet the species are all more closely related to the South American species. Okay? And then when he gets to the Galapagos, right, is this 5-year trip. And it's on the Galapagos that he's collecting all these bird species, and he's putting it into his notebooks. And one of the things that's kind of hard for Darwin is that he has to collect what we would call now kind of the type specimen. What one am I going to collect? And he actually said he wasn't so good in birds. He's more of a botanist. And so he took very detailed notes on all of these birds and sent them all back to an ornithologist in London to get identified. And the ornithologist is working out what's going on with all these birds and what kind of categories are they going to be in. And because he had to take those detailed notes, he was looking at them and getting type specimens for the different habitats. And the Galapagos are volcanic islands. They straddle the equator off of South America, off Quito. Excuse me, Ecuador, not Quito. And you can see their volcanic cinder cones there. And so even in Darwin's time, it's kind of interesting is that even though they, if you believed in natural theology, the earth didn't change, people recognize that volcanoes, I guess, were the exception. They would change, right? And so they knew that these islands were volcanic, meaning that they probably popped up out of the ocean by volcanic activity. And so looking at the diversity of these finches that are there, and just look at these 3 beak sizes. You have a very fine insect-eating beak. You have a very hard and kind of crossed and sometimes a little bit of an extension on it for ripping soft flesh, kind of like a parrot would have. And then you have a very tough, strong beak for eating the seed eating of larger fruits, larger seeds. So you need that strength. And so Darwin put together, looking at all those finches, right, how they would relate and how they all came from a common ancestor. And so you got the descent with modification, all right, as we've gone over in this process. Right? Afterwards, he actually took this and even went further, and his second book was on Descent of Man, and he talked about human evolution, and putting, again, Lamarck in context. He simply took Lamarck, published a book using his idea on evolution on stating how humans were derived from other apes, right? So Darwin wasn't the first. Darwin simply basically took a lot of the evidence that Lamarck had and presented it with his idea of how evolution worked with natural selection, right? And so that caused a lot of controversy. Um, but he wasn't afraid of that at the time. He actually went and published that book on human evolution. And so this is kind of the take-home message you want. I've listed here kind of one main thing for each of these people so you can see how all of these people contributed and that without these people probably wouldn't have our theory of evolution when we did. It would take longer time, right? And these same things would be contributing to Wallace coming up with the same kind of idea. So Linnaeus giving us all of these categories, all right, so how things are relating now, we talk about how they relate, but back then just grouping them in the categories, there's got to be a logical reason why they're going in those categories, right? Lamarck giving first one to really publish a comprehensive idea on species changing over time in response to the environment. Cuvier, fossil records of past life, right? So we know there's evidence that life looked different, and the farther back you go, the more different it looks. Malthus, a lot of the mechanism on the population levels coming from Malthus, the limited resources, competition, survival for richest, for evolution, it will be fittest, right? And Lyell, the age of the earth and the slow, gradual process that he's thinking of that evolution following along that, right? Wallace comes up also with natural selection, but also he was the impetus to get Darwin to actually publish his work. And so we finished chapter 22, and so you want to review the three segments of the lecture and look at, if you haven't done the evolution simulation, you want to do that. And then before you move on to the next chapter, you want to do our quiz. So there's an online quiz. Remember, you can take it as many times as you like up to the due date, and so you can take it multiple times. And if you want to see all the questions, you would actually have to go through and take it many times.